Chapter 4, Lesson 2. In this lesson, I'm going to walk you through a few tricks and tips about putting your musical cell together. Now, in all of the examples I've shown you so far, the cells have been extremely simple. Just a couple of notes, 2 notes like we saw in the Jaws example. And even David Hirschfelder's example for the dressmaker was just 2 notes alternating, really. So in all of the examples we've seen, the cell has been incredibly simple, and that's what you're aiming to achieve with your musical cell. So first up, try and avoid lots of random notes that don't really fit in one key signature. So for example, if we're in the key of C, there are no black notes, it's just all of the white notes from C to C. So you want to try and keep your musical cell within that key. Something like that, for example, would be cool. But if you start adding in random black notes that don't really fit that key, you're going to back yourself into a corner and make it really hard to develop that cell later on. So first up, try and keep your cell within the key that you've chosen. Now, single notes can be incredibly powerful. Something like a repeated C could, in fact, be quite a successful cell. Now, that might seem boring, and okay, it kind of is on its own, but there's a lot we can do to develop a single repeated note. And that's where the magic is, in that development of our original cell. So at the moment, we're not really thinking about that. We're just trying to come up with 3 or 4 notes that make a really good cell. So if we used a single repeated note, now we think, okay, that's boring, and maybe it is, but we've got enormous flexibility about how we then transform that and rework that into other things, especially if we start using pivot notes in the harmonies underneath. Suddenly this bland old repeated note can start going on some pretty incredible adventures. So a pivot harmony is simply trying to find any chord that has a C in it. Now, the obvious one is C major. C minor also has a C in the chord. But now we can start thinking a bit outside the box. A minor has C in that chord. It's now the middle note. A flat major has a C in the chord. F has a C in the chord. Now that's kind of a cool progression if we played that all together. All right, now it starts to sound a little bit like, a John Williams, Star Wars-esque kind of thing. So, don't dismiss simplicity, because we can flesh that out later, which we'll talk about in the coming lessons. Now, obviously your repeated note like this is quite simple, could be a little bland, so start giving it some flavor by adding some rhythm to it, perhaps. That could be a cool cell now. Cool, and then we can flesh that out later. Okay, cool, so just some messing around there. All right, a minor third is another popular choice for a cell idea. In fact, that was the exact cell that David Hirschfelder used for the main theme from The Dressmaker, using this sort of alternating minor third. That was it. That is essentially the cell he used for the entire score. And again, we can easily transform this little cell And that's kind of what we're aiming for. So it's nice and simple. Okay, so you can start to see that even though the cell is simple, what we do with it is where the interest is. Now, it's also okay to give your cell a slightly juicy note. Now, earlier in this lesson, I said, try and avoid going to random black notes or notes that don't really fit the key that you've chosen. That's just going to make life hard for you. But it's okay to use some juicy notes in your cell. In fact, that is the cell that Hans Zimmer used in his Man of Steel score. Now, that note there, that B is a little bit crunchy because it's the 7th note of the scale. Now, a little bit of theory here, guys. The 7th note of the scale is the juiciest of all of the notes of your scale. So to include that in a cell is risky, but it's only one note, and it's something that falls back to a note that feels a little more stable, like that C there. So it's just adding a little bit of flavor. You can hear it does create a little bit of dissonance, a little bit of tension, but it's not too wacky. And depending on the context of your orchestral piece and your original idea, maybe a little bit of juiciness isn't a bad thing. Now, if your original idea was to write a piece based on the emotion of sadness, having something like that may not work. Feels a little more heroic. But maybe if your original idea was sadness, so let's go, what key do we want to be in? E minor. So let's say your original idea is sadness. So coming up with a cell that feels sad or connects back to that is a great idea. So there's that juicy note, okay? It doesn't really resolve, it's sort of left hanging. But because it feels like it should resolve down to the E, it does create almost a sense of yearning. It feels like it should be falling. And if we're writing a piece of music that has that intention, then that cell could work really well. On the flip side, if you're writing something that is positive and uplifting, having a downward falling cell is probably not your best bet. So maybe something in a major key is a great start, and using some rising intervals. Okay, that has a much more positive, uplifting flavor to it. Now this could be a great little cell, just those 3 notes. There's so much we could do with that. Okay, that's got heaps of potential right there. Now, 4ths and 5ths are also really powerful notes that we can use in creating a cell. In the last lesson, I spoke about the fact that a 5th is very neutral. So when we say a 5th, we're talking about the interval of a 5th, or the distance between 2 notes of a scale. So a 5th, in this case, if we're in C major, that's our scale. Every scale has 8 notes. And G is simply 5 notes away from the beginning, so it's a 5th, the interval of a 5th. This would be a 4th, and this would be a 6th. Now, in fact, this is a little cell, another Hans Zimmer example from Man of Steel. It opens with a 5th, and then is followed by a 4th. That's his simple little cell that he builds the entire score from. Okay, Okay, so that's the basic cell. Of course, we can start adding things to it later. And then brings back that cell. So it's almost like it's got two cells. And that's okay. Sometimes you can have two cells that work back to back, and that's a common technique in film scoring, that one cell might represent one character or one situation or one kind of emotion in the film, and then the other cell has got a different kind of purpose. And every time those things reoccur in the film, we hear those different cells, or leitmotifs as we also call them. Now, for the purposes of what you guys are doing, one cell is fine. If you're feeling adventurous, you can certainly write two alternating cells that you can play off each other throughout your orchestral piece. Now, as I've said, these fifths and fourths are fantastic intervals to use in a cell. The reason for that is because these intervals are known as perfect intervals, because they don't change depending on whether you're in a major key or a minor key. Let me give you a quick example. In C major, these are the notes we use. In C minor, these are the notes we use. Okay, so you'll notice that that fifth note and that fourth note never changed depending on the scale. In the minor scale, that F is still there, and so is that G. And the same thing in a major scale. So that's why they're known as perfect intervals. They never change. They're not major, they're not minor. They exist in both of those different types of scales. So they're really, really versatile to use in your cell, because you can kind of shift and change from major to minor pretty seamlessly, because those intervals never change. So for example, I could be here. That's very neutral. We don't know if we're major or minor yet. Minor. And now suddenly I can move to major. Okay, cool. So there's so much versatility in what you can do with the intervals of fourths and fifths. Okay, so there's a few suggestions about using certain intervals, using some juicy notes, or especially to try and create some type of specific emotional impact. We've also talked about fourths and fifths and how powerful they are, and also keeping things super simple. Even just that repeated note, using those pivot harmonies, can be super powerful. You can give a little bit of rhythm to your notes. So in this case, they're all just very straight, evenly spaced notes. But if that was your cell, give it a little bit of interest with a change in rhythm. That could become a fantastic little cell. Okay, so your job is to come up with a simple little cell, 2, 3, or 4 notes maximum, that we can then take and start transforming in the next lesson.